The wind had teeth, and it was chewing on the last warmth of the day. It swept across the Wyoming prairie, a low moan that carried the scent of cold dust and distant pine. Above, the sky was a spill of black ink, pricked with a million tiny holes, letting the light of heaven through. Down below, a single campfire pushed back against the immense dark. It painted flickering light on the weathered face of a man who looked as much a part of the landscape as the sagebrush and the stone. Eli Booker was 35 years old. Though the last winter had carved another decade into the lines around his eyes, he sat cross-legged, watching the flames dance. The fire was his only companion most nights, its crackle and pop a conversation of sorts. He was a contract cowboy, his worldly possessions packed on the mule tethered nearby. His life was a series of long, empty spaces between one cattle drive and the next. This particular empty space felt longer than most. He nursed a tin cup of coffee, the bitter heat a small comfort against the memory of a winter that had taken too much. A sound broke the rhythm of the wind. The snap of a dry twig. It was sharp, close. Eli did not move, but his stillness changed. It became the stillness of a predator, every sense reaching out into the darkness beyond the firelight. He had heard that sound 1,000 times. A coyote, maybe a deer stepping carelessly. But this was followed by a gasp, a human sound of breath tearing from a throat. Then the world tumbled into his small circle of light. It was a girl, or a young woman, all tangled limbs and desperation. She tripped on a root at the edge of the clearing and fell forward, landing in a heap on the hard-packed earth not 5 feet from his fire. Her dress was torn at the hem and stained with mud. Her thin canvas shoes looked like they had been through a war. She pushed herself up onto her hands and knees, her chest heaving. For a long moment she just breathed, her head bowed. Then she looked up, her eyes wide and wild in the firelight. She whispered the words, a prayer of pure terror. "They are chasing me." Eli took a slow sip of his coffee. He set the cup down carefully on a flat rock beside him. He shifted his weight, the leather of his chaps creaking in the sudden quiet. He pushed his hat back on his head, his gaze steady on the woman who had just crashed into his solitude. A strange thought, dry and laced with a humor only he could appreciate, formed in his mind. He spoke it aloud, his voice a low rumble that was more for himself than for her. "A virgin stumbled into my campfire." He paused, the flames reflecting in his eyes. He added, quieter still, a joke to soothe the sudden tension in his own gut. "And maybe my lonely nights are over." The woman flinched at his words. A deep blush rose on her cheeks, a wave of color visible even in the dim light. It was a strange sight, that flush of embarrassment on a face so pale with fear. The moment hung between them, awkward and yet strangely warm, a flicker of life in the vast, cold emptiness. He saw that she was young, maybe 22. She carried herself with a cautious stillness, even now, with her breath coming in ragged bursts. There was a composure under the panic, a strength in the way she held her chin. She was not from a place like this. She was from a town, one of those small settlements on the edge of nowhere, where the rules were supposed to keep you safe. He motioned with his head toward the coffee pot sitting near the coals. She watched him, wary as a rabbit. He poured a measure of the dark liquid into his spare cup and pushed it across the ground toward her. She stared at it for a second before reaching out with a trembling hand to take it, her fingers wrapped around the warm tin. He did not ask her name. He did not ask who was chasing her. He asked the only question that mattered for now. "What kind of trouble are you in?" She took a shaky sip of the coffee, the warmth seeming to steady her. She told him then, her voice low and hurried. Her name was Rosa May Callahan. She had been a witness. She had seen Sheriff Cade Locke, the lawman from the nearest town of Heaton's Ford, meeting with Silas McKean, a cattle baron whose herds choked the valley. They were not alone, a miner, a man with a lawful deed to a spring that fed the prettiest creek in the territory. was with them. There was an argument, a piece of paper, then violence, swift and brutal and final. The miner was gone. His body weighted and dropped into the very spring he had fought to protect. Rosa had seen it all from a thicket of willows. In the panic that followed, as they searched for the deed, she had found something they missed, a piece of a boundary map, torn from the original document. It was marked with the miner's name, and it was stained with his blood. She pulled it from a hidden pocket inside her dress. It was a small, crumpled square of paper, but in the firelight, the dark stain was unmistakable. "This could take them to court," she said, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "This could see them hang." Eli looked from the blood-stained paper to her earnest, terrified face. He felt a familiar weariness settle over him. He had spent his life avoiding the affairs of powerful men. Getting tangled in the business of a man like Silas McKean, a man who bought sheriffs like he bought cattle, was a good way to shorten your life. He spoke the thought plainly. Meddling in the quarrels of the strong is just asking for trouble. "Miss..." His words seemed to suck the hope right out of her. Her shoulders slumped, the light in her eyes flickered, and he saw the sheer depth of her fear. It was the fear of an animal caught in a trap, with the hunter getting closer. He had seen that look before, in the eyes of men and beasts, and it never failed to stir something in him, something he had tried to bury deep after that last hard winter. His resolve softened. He could not just send her back out into that devouring darkness. He let out a long breath. "You can stay the night. The ground is hard, but the fire is warm. In return, you will tell me everything before the sun comes up. Every last detail." Relief washed over her face so completely it was like watching a parched plant drink water. She nodded, unable to speak. Later, as the fire burned down to glowing embers, a new sound came on the wind. It was a chorus of howls, distant but clear. A wolf pack on the move. Rosa stiffened, her eyes darting toward the darkness. Eli reached for his rifle, the familiar weight of it settling in his hands. He did not do it to shoot. He just wanted to feel its presence. He looked over at her. He held the rifle out. "Ever held one of these?" She shook her head. He pushed it gently into her hands. The weapon was heavy, foreign to her. She tried to lift it to her shoulder, to sight down the long barrel as she must have seen men do. Her arms trembled under the weight. Eli moved without thinking. He shifted behind her, his body close but not touching hers. He reached out and placed his hand over her wrist, his calloused fingers covering her delicate ones. His touch was light, meant only to steady the rifle. "Just breathe easy," he said, his voice low beside her ear. "Let the stock rest against your shoulder. Do not fight it." She took a shaky breath and did as he said. Under his guidance, the trembling eased, the barrel steadied. For a moment, they stayed like that, his hand over hers, both of them staring out into the star-dusted night where the wolves sang their wild song. It was a fleeting connection, a moment of shared purpose and quiet intimacy that had no name. When the time came to sleep, he laid out the single hide blanket he owned. It was not big enough for two people to sleep comfortably, but it was better than the cold ground. He motioned for her to take the side nearest the fire. He lay down on the colder edge, his back to her, a silent promise of safety and respect. He was a wall between her and the vast, dark prairie. He closed his eyes, listening to the wind and the faint crackle of the dying embers. From behind him, her voice came, so soft it was almost part of the wind. "Thank you, Cowboy." He did not answer. He just lay there, the simple words warming him more than the fire ever could. For the first time in a long time, the silence of the prairie did not feel quite so empty. He must have drifted off, because a change in the light brought him back. He opened his eyes. Far off, on the low rise of a distant hill, tiny points of light were moving. Torches, a line of them, bobbing and weaving through the darkness, coming their way. He sat up slowly, his body tense. It was the sheriff. It had to be. They were hunting her, sweeping the prairie with a posse. He looked over at Rosa. She was asleep, her face softened and peaceful for the first time since she had fallen into his camp. The coming sunrise, he knew, was going to be a very long one indeed. He did not need to wake her. The shift in the night air, the subtle change in his posture was enough. Rosa's eyes opened, instantly alert. He pointed a single finger toward the distant hill, toward the creeping line of torches. There was no time for words. He kicked dirt over the fire, smothering the last of the glowing embers into a puff of smoke that the wind snatched away. He moved with a quiet efficiency, strapping his bedroll. Grabbing the coffee pot and his rifle, he loaded the mule with swift, practiced motions. He went to Rosa, expecting to find her frozen. Instead, she was already on her feet, her borrowed blanket folded neatly, her eyes fixed on the approaching lights. She was afraid. He could see that in the rigid set of her shoulders, but she was not hysterical. She was waiting for his lead. He pointed north, toward a dark spine of cottonwood trees that marked a shallow, winding creek bed. It was their only cover. They moved into the darkness, the mule's soft footsteps and the rustle of their own clothes swallowed by the constant sigh of the wind. They walked for what felt like hours, keeping to the low ground, the torches of the posse a hateful constellation behind them. Just as the first pale light began to bleed into the eastern sky, Eli stopped. He had led them to a place that was not on any map. It was an old winter camp his former boss had used, abandoned now for 2 seasons. A small, sturdy cabin sat hunkered against a low rise, with a dilapidated barn leaning beside it like a tired old man. A shallow well, likely dry, was marked by a circle of stones. The whole place had the look of a forgotten memory. In the small corral, a lone horse stood with its head hung low. It was an old gelding, sway-backed and scarred, but its eyes were clear. The horse nickered softly as they approached, a sound of weary welcome. Eli ran a hand down the animal's neck. "This is Lucky," he said, the first words he had spoken since leaving the campfire. "He is all that is left of the place." Lucky seemed a fitting name for a creature that had survived out here on its own. He was a symbol of stubborn endurance. The cabin was one room, thick with the smell of dust and cold ashes. But it was solid. The log walls chinked tight against the wind. A crude wooden bed frame stood in one corner, a rickety table and 2 chairs in the center. It was a shelter. Nothing more, but to Rosa, it felt like a fortress. Eli established the rules of their new life without ceremony. "The cabin is yours," he said, gesturing to the small space. "I will take the barn." He would be close, but not too close. He would teach her to shoot properly, starting that afternoon. And he laid down the most important rule with a quiet gravity that left no room for misunderstanding. He would not touch her without her permission. He was offering her safety, not claiming ownership. In the days that followed, they fell into a strange, unspoken rhythm. A ritual of trust began to build between them, brick by silent brick. Every morning, when Rosa woke, she would find a tin cup of warm milk on the floor just inside her door. Eli had found a stray goat with a kid, and he milked her at dawn. It was a simple, nourishing gift, a daily assurance that she was not alone. In return, Rosa took his worn-out shirt, the one with the tear in the shoulder, and mended it with thread she unraveled from the hem of her own ruined dress. Her stitches were small and neat, a language of care he had not known in years. She took the meager supplies he had and cooked meals that tasted more like a home than anything he could remember. She took a piece of charcoal and a strip of bark and began to keep a careful tally of their food, a small act of order in their chaotic world. Eli had to go into town for flour and salt. He rode Lucky, the old horse surprisingly steady on his feet. He left Rosa with the rifle and a stern warning to hide if she saw anyone. Heaton's Ford was a town struggling to be born, It had a church with a new steeple, a saloon with loud music, and the small print shop of the local newspaper, run by a woman Eli knew and respected, a widow named Lydia Hart. A half-finished railroad line ended abruptly in a field of weeds just beyond the last building, a monument to broken promises. The law in Heaton's Ford was whatever Sheriff Cade Locke said it was, and everyone knew the sheriff answered to Silas McKean. Eli saw the deputy, Harlan, watching him from the porch of the sheriff's office. Harlan was a young man with conflicted eyes, a man who followed orders but did not seem to enjoy it. Eli ignored him, tying Lucky outside the general store. Inside, the whispers started. The town was a tinderbox of gossip, and the sight of Eli Booker, a man who kept to himself, buying supplies for two, was enough to set it ablaze. He heard his name linked with the story of a runaway girl, a story the sheriff had been spreading. He bought what he needed, his face a mask of indifference, and rode out. He also paid a visit to an old friend who lived in the rocky hills above the town. Miguel Ortega was a trapper, a man whose face was a roadmap of sun and wind. He and Eli had ridden together years ago. Eli told him just enough that he was sheltering a woman in trouble, and that the trouble was named McKean. Miguel listened, his dark eyes missing nothing. He promised to keep his ears open and to watch the trails. When Eli returned, he found Rosa practicing with the rifle, just as he had shown her. She was determined, but clumsy. He decided it was time she learned to ride. He put her on Lucky, the old horse patient, as a saint. Rosa sat stiffly, her back straight, her hands clutching the saddle horn as if it were the rail of a sinking ship. "Loosen up," Eli said, his voice dry. "You are holding on so tight, you are going to squeeze the air right out of him." She tried to relax, but her body was a knot of tension. She looked like she was sitting in a church pew, waiting for a sermon. Eli watched her for a moment, a rare flicker of amusement in his eyes. "Do not ride it like you are reading the Holy Bible," he said. "Say amen too soon and you will fall." A surprised laugh escaped her, a clear, bright sound that seemed to chase the shadows from the dusty corral. She laughed so hard her wide-brimmed hat, one Eli had given her, tilted and fell to the ground. For a moment, she was not a fugitive. She was just a young woman laughing in the sun. But the shadows were never far. They lived inside them both. Eli found himself staring at the horizon as the days grew shorter, a familiar tightness in his chest. He hated the approach of winter. The clean, cold air held the ghost of a blizzard from long ago, a storm that had stolen his younger brother from the world. It was a wound that had never truly closed, a private grief he never spoke of. He saw a similar guardedness in Rosa. She spoke of the town, of her work as a seamstress, but she never mentioned her family. He knew she had a stepfather, but she avoided any mention of her life in his house, her past a locked room she refused to open. The town's gossip eventually found its way to their sanctuary. The preacher, a man with a pinched face and condemning eyes, rode out to the camp one afternoon. He spoke of virtue and reputation, his words aimed at Rosa like stones. He implied that a woman of good character would not be living alone in the wilderness with an unmarried man. Eli stood by silently, letting Rosa find her own voice. She faced the preacher, her chin held high. "My character is not determined by where I sleep," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "It is determined by what I do." The preacher left in a huff, his mission of moral correction a failure. Through all of this, the small, blood-stained map remained a secret between them, or so Rosa thought. She had found a hiding place for it, a small wooden box filled with dried corn husks she used for kindling. She tucked the map deep at the bottom, beneath the rustling husks. She did it when she thought Eli was out checking his snares. But Eli saw. He had been in the shade of the barn, mending a strap on his saddle. He saw her furtive movements, the care with which she concealed the small piece of paper. He said nothing. He pretended he had not seen. The map was her burden to carry, her decision to share. He would not force her hand. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and purple, a wagon rattled up the faint track to the camp. It was Lydia Hart. She was a woman in her 40s, with intelligent eyes and a no-nonsense set to her jaw. She brought them a sack of fresh apples and the latest edition of her newspaper. She got straight to the point. "The whole town is talking," she said, looking from Eli to Rosa. "Sheriff Locke is painting this girl as a thief and a runaway. Silas McKean is offering a reward." She looked directly at Rosa. "If you have what you say you have, proof of what they did, then we have a chance. But it is a slim one." Her voice was kind, but unsparingly honest. "If you want justice, you need more than a piece of paper. You need a living witness who can stand up in front of a judge, and you need official documents to back her story. Right now, all you have is a bloody scrap and a whole lot of trouble. Time is not on your side." Lydia's words hung in the quiet air as she climbed back into her wagon and drove away. The weight of her warning settled over the small camp, heavy as a shroud. A living witness was a target, and their time was running out. The spring that year was born with a fever. The sun, a pale disk in a hazy sky, offered no warmth, only a dry, baking heat. The rains did not come. The creek shrank to a muddy trickle between cracked banks. The grass on the prairie turned from green to a brittle yellow, and the wind, their constant companion, became an enemy. It picked up the topsoil and threw it in their faces, a gritty, relentless assault. A dust storm rolled in one afternoon, not with the drama of a thunderhead, but like a slow, dirty tide. The sky turned the color of a fresh bruise. The world shrank to the small space of the camp, the air so thick you could taste the earth on your tongue. Rosa, caught outside bringing in the goat, was seized by a fit of coughing, her body racked by harsh, dry spasms. Eli moved quickly. He tore a strip from a clean flour sack, soaked it in the precious water from their barrel, and gently tied it over her nose and mouth. His fingers brushed her cheek, a brief, impersonal contact that still sent a jolt through the suffocating air. He led her into the cabin and shut the door, plunging them into a dim, dusty twilight. When the storm finally passed hours later, it left the world coated in a fine red powder. But as the air cleared, another scent reached them, sharp and acrid. Smoke. Not the familiar smell of their own cook fire, but the smell of something burning that should not be. Eli was out the door in an instant. The large haystack he had carefully built near the barn, their winter feed for Lucky and the goat, was a pillar of fire and black smoke. It was not a wildfire. It had been set deliberately. A roaring message from Silas McKean. There was nothing to do but watch it burn. Eli stood with his fists clenched, his jaw tight, a cold fury in his eyes. He had saved the barn itself, the flames having only licked and blackened its old, dry wood. But the loss of the hay was a serious blow. It was a warning, a tightening of the screw. They were telling him this patch of land was not a refuge. It was a cage, and they could set it on fire whenever they pleased. The next day, the tension from the fire still hanging thick between them, Eli brought out a long, coiled rope. He began to build a loop, his hands moving with an easy, fluid grace. He wanted to teach Rosa how to use a lariat. It is a tool, not a weapon, he told her, but a useful one. She tried to imitate him, her fingers clumsy and stiff. The rope was heavy and fought her at every turn. He stepped behind her, his voice a low murmur near her ear as he guided her. His chest was close to her back, the heat of his body a solid presence. He took her hands in his, rearranging her fingers on the rope, showing her the proper way to hold the coil. His touch was firm, instructive. Her breath hitched. The air between them grew charged, filled with the things they did not say, the boundaries they had so carefully erected now feeling thin as smoke. After the rope, she looked at the hunting knife on his belt. "Teach me how to use that, too," she said, her voice quiet but resolute. "For defense." He looked at her, saw the new hardness in her eyes, and nodded slowly. That night, she found him sitting on the edge of the cabin's small porch, staring out at the stars. She sat beside him, not too close, leaving a respectable space between them. The silence stretched, comfortable. She was thinking about the fire, about the preacher, about the constant, looming threat. A thought, insidious and sharp, pricked at her. Was she becoming a possession? An object to be protected? Her own will secondary to his? She was grateful for his shelter, for his quiet strength, but she feared trading one kind of cage for another. She spoke her fear into the darkness. "I am afraid that being kept safe means I will lose the right to choose for myself." Eli did not look at her. He kept his gaze fixed on the heavens, but his voice, when he answered, was steady and clear. "You choose for yourself here, Rosa, always." His words were a promise, a gift more valuable than any physical protection. They settled a deep anxiety within her, clearing a space for trust to grow. A few days later, Miguel Ortega appeared at the edge of the camp as silently as a shadow. He brought news. He had been tracking the creek that fed the now dead miner's spring, high up, near the source. He had found something. Marks drilled into the rock, the kind made for blasting powder. Silas McKean was not just content with owning the spring. He was planning to change the very course of the creek, to divert the water to his own vast stretches of land and leave every smaller rancher downstream to wither and die. Suddenly, Rosa's crumpled, blood-stained piece of paper became more than just evidence of a murder. It was the key to McKean's entire scheme. The lines on it, showing the original boundaries and water rights, were the only official proof that could stop him. The news had barely settled when riders appeared on the horizon. 3 of them. Eli recognized the lead rider immediately. Deputy Harlan. Eli met them in the open, his rifle held loosely in one hand. He stood between them and the cabin where Rosa was hidden. Harlan dismounted, his 2 companions staying on their horses. They were hard-looking men, the kind who wore their guns tied low and their morals even lower. "Just a friendly visit, Booker," Harlan said, his voice trying for casual but failing. "The sheriff heard you were squatting out here." Eli's voice was cold as a winter river. "I am not squatting. I am working the property for the owner." He did not say that the owner was long gone and had given him leave to stay as long as he liked. Harlan's eyes flickered toward the cabin. "We heard you had company." Just then, the cabin door opened. Rosa stepped out. She wore a simple apron over her dress and her hair was tied back. She kept her eyes downcast, moving with the shuffling steps of a tired servant. She did not look at the men. She was playing the part they had rehearsed, the part of a mute hired girl. A tense, strange humor filled the air. Eli saw a flicker of confusion in Harlan's eyes. As Rosa passed behind Eli to fetch a bucket, she stumbled, and the tin pot she was carrying clattered to the ground. The sound was loud in the silence. One of the hired guns laughed. Harlan's eyes narrowed, his suspicion returning. Eli spoke into the quiet, his voice bone dry. "She is mute." He paused for a beat. "When she is not angry." The 2 hired guns snickered. Harlan looked from Eli's deadpan face to Rosa's downcast one and seemed to decide it was not worth pursuing. He grunted, mounted his horse, and led his men away. That evening, the memory of the close call lingered. They sat on the porch again, listening to the chirping of the crickets. The air was cool and soft, without thinking. Rosa leaned her head against Eli's shoulder. It was a simple gesture of exhaustion and trust. She felt his entire body go still. He did not pull away, but he did not respond. She could feel the rigid control in him, the battle he was fighting with himself. He wanted to put his arm around her. She could feel the unspoken impulse, but he would not. He would not cross the line he himself had drawn. His respect for her was a physical thing, a wall he would not breach. and in its own way, it was more intimate than any touch. Lydia's newspaper arrived a few days later. Delivered by a freight driver Miguel had paid. In it, she had written a sharp editorial. It did not mention Rosa by name, but it spoke of the nature of virtue. Virtue, Lydia wrote, is not measured by the gossip of idle tongues, but by the courage to stand for what is right in the face of power. She was planting seeds of defiance in the town's consciousness. The article, and the memory of Harlan's visit, seemed to unlock something in Rosa. That night, sitting by the fire, she finally told him about her stepfather. He was a stern, controlling man who saw her not as a daughter but as an asset. He had arranged a marriage for her, to a wealthy older man, a business associate. She was to be part of a transaction. I chose to run. She finished, her voice barely a whisper, rather than be sold. Eli listened without interruption. When she was done, he simply nodded. He did not question her. He did not offer pity. He offered something far better, belief. His quiet acceptance was the final piece of the foundation of her trust in him. The next morning, Rosa woke with a new resolve. She walked to where Eli was cleaning his rifle. "I am ready," she said. "I want to shoot for real now." She stood at the line he had marked in the dirt, with deliberate movements. She removed the small silver earrings she always wore and tucked them in her pocket. She pulled the tie from her hair and redid it, pulling it back tight and severe. She was no longer a young woman in trouble. She was a soldier preparing for battle. He placed a tin can on a fence post 50 yards away. He handed her the rifle. This time, she did not tremble. She lifted the heavy weapon, settled the stock against her shoulder, and took a slow, deep breath, just as he had taught her. She sighted down the barrel, the small can a distant speck. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked hard against her shoulder. The explosion shattered the prairie quiet. For a second, nothing happened. Then, with a satisfying ping, the tin can flew off the fence post, tumbling through the air. A slow smile spread across Eli Booker's face. It was a rare sight, like finding a wildflower blooming in the desert. It was a smile of surprise, of approval, and of something that looked a lot like pride. Lydia Hart returned a week later, her wagon kicking up a cloud of the fine, red dust that now seemed to be the very air they breathed. She did not bring apples this time. She brought a thick, leather-bound book. She spread it open on the rickety table in Eli's barn, the pages filled with dense, formal script. "This is the Territorial Water Code," she said, her finger tracing a line of text. "It is complicated, but the heart of it is simple. Water rights are tied to the land and the date of the claim. The miner, Matthew Rowe. His claim was one of the first in this valley. His rights are ironclad." She looked at Rosa, her eyes serious. Miguel was right. If Silas McKean diverts that creek, he is not just stealing from a dead man, he is stealing the future from every small rancher and farmer down the line. Without that water, their land is worthless. They will be starved out, and he will buy their property for pennies on the dollar. The small, blood-stained map was no longer just a piece of evidence. It was a declaration of war for the entire valley. The weight of it seemed to press down on Rosa, the responsibility vast and terrifying. She was not just fighting for her own life anymore. The next morning, the war came directly to her. Eli found the letter pinned to the cabin door with a hunting knife. It was a single sheet of paper, the message scrawled in a crude, bold hand. The words were few, but they carried the force of a death sentence. "Give us the map and live." It was signed with a flourish, Sheriff Cade Locke. The air went still and cold. The threat was no longer a distant line of torches or a posse of riders. It was here, at her door. It knew her name. It knew what she possessed. Eli read the note, his face becoming a mask of stone. He pulled the knife from the wood and looked at Rosa, his eyes dark with a protective fury. "That is it," he said, his voice low and final. "We are done here. I will take you to Colorado. We can be across the border in 3 days. You can disappear, start a new life. He was offering her an escape, a return to the anonymity she had craved when she first stumbled into his camp. But something inside her had shifted. The girl who had run from her stepfather's house, who had hidden in the willows, was not the same woman who stood before him now. She had learned to shoot a rifle. She had faced down a preacher. She had discovered a strength she never knew she had. She shook her head, her gaze unwavering. "No, I am not running anymore." Eli stared at her, a mixture of frustration and grudging admiration in his eyes. "Rosa, this is not a game. These men will kill you without a second thought." "I know," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "But if I run, they win. Not just against me, against everyone." Their wills clashed in the silent cabin. Two opposing forces of nature, his desperate need to protect her, and her newfound refusal to be protected at the expense of what was right. That afternoon, the sky, which had been a merciless, empty blue for weeks, began to curdle. Dark, bruised-looking clouds gathered on the horizon, and the wind picked up, carrying the first cool scent of rain. The storm broke with a sudden violence, the rain coming down not in drops but in solid, wind-driven sheets. Thunder cracked overhead, shaking the small cabin. They worked together, rushing to get the goat and old Lucky into the relative shelter of the leaning barn. The rain was cold, plastering their clothes to their bodies in seconds. As they stood in the barn doorway, watching the deluge turn the dusty ground to a sea of mud, a flash of lightning illuminated the prairie, followed by a deafening clap of thunder. Rosa flinched, a small, involuntary gasp escaping her. Without thinking, she reached out and took Eli's hand. Her fingers were cold, and they laced through his, a desperate, anchoring grip in the midst of the storm's fury. He looked down at their joined hands, then at her face, her eyes wide and fixed on the storm. For a moment, the rigid control he always maintained seemed to melt away. He did not pull his hand back. Instead, he moved, shifting his body to shield her from the wind and the driving rain. He raised his free arm and draped his heavy canvas coat over her shoulders, pulling her closer. And then, as another roll of thunder shook the earth, he leaned down and pressed his lips to her forehead. It was not a kiss of passion, but of comfort. It was a gesture of profound tenderness, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that had grown between them. It was the first time he had allowed himself to be close to her, to offer solace instead of just protection. He had crossed his own line, not to take, but to give. The rain brought a temporary peace, but it also brought a traitor, Barnaby Pike, a rancher whose small property bordered the old winter camp, had seen the smoke from the haystack fire. He had a crippling gambling debt at the saloon in Heaton's Ford, a debt owned by Silas McKean. The reward for information on the runaway girl was more money than Barnaby had seen in a year. He rode into town that evening, the rain dripping from the brim of his hat, and told Sheriff Locke exactly where to find them. The posse arrived the next day, a dozen men led by a triumphant Sheriff Cade. They fanned out, surrounding the cabin and barn. Eli met them in the open, Rosa standing a few paces behind him, her face pale but her expression resolute. "I do not have a warrant." "Booker," Cade announced, a smirk on his face. "But I have a dozen reasons right here that say I do not need one. I am searching this property." Before Eli could answer, a wagon came rattling up the muddy track. Lydia Hart sat on the driver's seat, holding the reins in one hand and her thick law book in the other. She pulled to a halt, her timing impeccable. "Actually, Sheriff, you do," she said, her voice clear and carrying. "Territorial Statute 3-7. A man's dwelling cannot be searched without a warrant signed by a circuit judge, unless he is in the act of committing a felony." She fixed him with a steely gaze. "Or does chasing down an unarmed woman now count as a felony in Heaton's Ford?" Several of the men in the posse shifted uncomfortably. They were ranchers and townsfolk, pressed into service. A few of them had begun to gather, drawn by the commotion. They watched, their faces grim. As the editor of the town paper faced down the sheriff, Cade's face flushed with anger. His authority, always absolute, was being questioned in public. He was outmaneuvered. With a curse, he wheeled his horse around. "This is not over," he snarled at Eli, and led his men away. The crowd of onlookers watched them go, their silent judgment more damaging to the sheriff's reputation than any shouted insult. As the last of the posse disappeared, another rider approached. This man was different. He was older, dressed in a fine black coat, and he rode a magnificent black stallion. It was Silas McKean. He dismounted and walked toward Eli, his eyes ignoring Rosa completely, as if she were a piece of the landscape. "You are a good man in a tight spot." "Booker," McKean said, his voice a low, reasonable purr. "I can appreciate that. I need good men. There is a place for you on my payroll. A steady wage. And I will see to it that the girl is left alone. All I ask for is your loyalty." He was offering a deal, a simple transaction, a man's soul for a woman's safety. Eli looked at the powerful man, at his clean hands and his expensive clothes, and he felt a profound and simple contempt. He thought of the dead miner, of the parched land, of the fear in Rosa's eyes. He shook his head slowly. "I do not sell my saddle, McKean." The words were quiet, but they were absolute. McKean's friendly mask dropped. His eyes went cold and hard. "A man who will not sell his saddle," he said softly, "is a man who will end up with nothing to ride." He turned, mounted his horse, and rode away, leaving a chill in the air that had nothing to do with the recent rain. After he was gone, a tremor went through Eli. He turned away from Rosa, unable to let her see the look on his face. He walked to the fence and gripped the top rail, his knuckles white. The fear he had kept buried for so long rose up, choking him. He saw a blizzard, white and blinding. He heard the wind screaming. He saw his younger brother, lost in the snow. A life snuffed out because of a choice Eli had made, a risk he had taken. He had sworn he would never again be the reason someone else paid the ultimate price. Now, his refusal to bend to McKean felt like he was setting that same tragic stage all over again. A sudden cry from Rosa broke his dark reverie. He spun around. In the muddy corral, Old Lucky had slipped. The horse was down on its side, struggling weakly, its legs tangled. The fall could be a death sentence for an old horse. Rosa was already at its side, speaking to it in a low, soothing voice, trying to untangle its legs. Eli was there in an instant, pushing the fear and the memories away, focusing on the immediate crisis. Together, they worked, their hands and clothes covered in mud. Eli positioned himself at the horse's back, Rosa at its head, and on the count of 3, they pushed and pulled, straining with all their might. For a moment, it seemed hopeless. Then, with a great groan, the old horse found its footing and struggled upright, standing shaky but alive. They stood there for a long moment, breathing hard, leaning against the horse and each other, a small, muddy trinity of survivors, their shared effort to save this one. Weak creature was a silent vow, a promise to protect the vulnerable, no matter the cost. That night, as they cleaned the mud from their clothes, Miguel Ortega slipped into camp. He brought jerky and a pouch of fresh coffee, but he also brought information, delivered in a low whisper by the light of the fire. "There is a ledger," he said. "McKean keeps a book of all his private dealings, payments to the sheriff, bribes, the money he spent on the blasting powder. He keeps it hidden. At the saloon, behind the big mirror over the bar." The path forward was suddenly clear. It was no longer about defending their small piece of ground. It was about attack. They had to get that book. It was a reckless, impossible plan, a direct assault on the heart of the enemy's territory, and they both knew, without saying a word, that it was what they had to do next. The saloon was the heart of Heaton's Ford. a noisy, smoky organ that pumped whiskey and gossip through the town's veins. Their plan was as thin as a gambler's promise. Relying on desperation and nerve, Miguel had slipped into town at dusk, a ghost in the alleys, and was waiting for the signal. Rosa, dressed in a borrowed drab brown dress Lydia had provided, her hair pinned up under a plain cap, looked like a dozen other tired young women trying to earn a few dollars in a hard world. She pushed through the swinging doors, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The wall of noise and stale air hit her. A piano player in the corner hammered out a tinny, cheerful tune that was at odds with the grim faces of the men at the bar. She found the owner, a portly man with a stained apron, and told him the story they had concocted. She was new in town, looking for work. "Willing to do anything?" He grunted and pointed her toward a stack of dirty glasses. An hour later, Eli came in. He did not walk so much as lurch, his hat askew, his movements exaggerated and clumsy. He stumbled into a table, sending a half-full beer mug crashing to the floor. He began to sing along with the piano, his voice a gravelly, off-key bellow. He was playing the part of a lonely cowboy on a long overdue binge, and he was playing it with a startling commitment. Rosa, carrying a tray of whiskey glasses, passed his table. He grabbed her arm, his grip surprisingly gentle for a man pretending to be 3 sheets to the wind. "Another drink, little lady," he slurred, winking theatrically. She pulled her arm away, giving him a look that was part of the act but also held a very real warning. "If you get truly drunk, cowboy, you had better not fall out of your saddle." He just grinned a lopsided, foolish grin and started singing again. His performance was a beautiful, chaotic distraction. Men laughed at him, a few shouted for him to shut up, but everyone was watching him. No one noticed the small, wiry figure of Miguel Ortega slip through the back door of the saloon and into the storeroom that connected to the main office. Rosa moved through the haze, collecting empty glasses, her senses on a knife's edge. She felt a pair of eyes on her and looked up to see Deputy Harlan sitting at a small table in the corner. He was not watching her face. He was staring at her feet. She looked down and her blood ran cold. In her haste, she had forgotten to change her shoes. She was still wearing the same worn canvas shoes she had arrived in, the ones with the distinctive, neat patch she had sewn onto the side. It was a tiny detail, a thread of her true self in a costume of lies. And it was enough. Harlan's eyes slowly lifted from her shoes to her face, a look of dawning recognition spreading across his features. He stood up. At that exact moment, the saloon doors swung open and Sheriff Cade Locke strode in, flanked by 2 of his hired guns. He surveyed the room, his gaze sweeping over the patrons before landing on Eli's loud, drunken display. A look of contempt crossed his face. He started toward the bar, but Harlan intercepted him, murmuring something in his ear and nodding toward Rosa. The sheriff's head snapped around. The air in the saloon seemed to crackle and go thin. The piano player's hands faltered on the keys, the music dying in a discordant jangle. Every eye in the room turned toward Rosa. Eli, his act of drunkenness falling away in an instant, was on his feet. "Well, well," Cade said, his voice dripping with false pleasantry. "Look what the cat dragged in. I believe you have something that belongs to me, girl." Rosa stood her ground, her tray of glasses held in front of her like a flimsy shield. "I do not know what you are talking about, Sheriff." "Do not play dumb with me," he snarled, taking a step toward her. Eli moved, placing himself squarely between them. "That is far enough." "Cade," Eli said, his voice quiet but carrying a deadly weight. The sheriff laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Booker, you have had too much to drink. Go sleep it off before you get hurt." Eli did not move. He was a wall of solid, unyielding defiance. Cade's amusement vanished, replaced by a flash of raw fury. He swung without warning, a heavy, brutal punch that caught Eli on the side of the jaw. Eli staggered back, the impact sending a shockwave through the room. In that split second of violence, Rosa acted on pure instinct. She was not a fighter, but she was a survivor. She grabbed the salt shaker from the nearest table and flung its contents directly into the eyes of the hired gun standing closest to her. The man roared in pain and surprise, clawing at his face. The saloon erupted into chaos. A short, vicious brawl broke out. It was a confusing mess of flying fists and overturned chairs. Through it all, Eli's focus was singular. He grabbed Rosa's arm and pulled her through the mayhem, heading for the small stage in the corner where the piano player was now cowering. He yanked back the dusty velvet curtain and pushed her into the small, dark space behind it. He followed her in, letting the curtain fall shut, plunging them into a world of shadows and the muffled sounds of the fight outside. The space was tiny, smelling of dust and stale beer. They were pressed together, her back against the rough wood of the wall, his body a shield in front of hers. She could feel the frantic beat of her own heart and the steady, powerful thud of his. He was breathing hard, a trickle of blood running from the corner of his mouth. He braced his hands on the wall on either side of her head, caging her in. His face was inches from hers, his eyes blazing with a fierce, protective light. In the dimness, she could see nothing but him. The noise of the saloon, the danger, the fear, it all faded away, replaced by the intense, overwhelming reality of his presence. He leaned closer, his voice a raw, desperate whisper that was for her and her alone. "No one touches you while I'm still breathing." The words were a vow, an oath sworn in the heart of the chaos. It was a declaration more intimate than a kiss, a promise of absolute devotion that left her breathless. It was not a claim of ownership. It was a statement of fact, as elemental as the ground beneath their feet. Just as the moment stretched, taut and electric, the curtain was ripped aside. Miguel stood there, his face grim. He held a thick leather ledger in one hand and a small, heavy metal seal in the other. He had it. Outside, the brawl was sputtering to a close, but a new sound cut through the noise, the deafening blast of a gunshot inside the enclosed room. Sheriff Cade stood near the bar, his pistol in his hand, a plume of smoke curling toward the ceiling. He had fired a shot into the wooden beams overhead, a wild, reckless act of dominance to quell the fighting. Rosa saw Deputy Harlan's face. He was staring at his sheriff, his expression one of pure, unadulterated shock. He was a lawman. You did not fire a weapon blindly into a crowd of citizens. It was a fundamental line, and Cade had just crossed it without a second thought. In that moment, the first deep cracks appeared in Harlan's loyalty. The gunshot had its intended effect. The fight was over. The townsfolk, cowed and frightened, began to back away. The battle lines in Heaton's Ford had just been drawn in gunpowder and blood. In the confusion, Eli, Rosa, and Miguel slipped out the back and melted into the alleyways. They made it to the edge of town where they had left the horses. Rosa, her mind still reeling from the violence and the intensity of the moment behind the curtain, felt a profound shift within herself. She had not been a damsel in distress waiting for rescue. She had fought back, and Eli had not treated her as property to be guarded, but as a partner to be defended. He had chosen her. The feeling was powerful, liberating. She knew then that she could not just be a witness. She had to be a voice. She would write it all down, her testimony, and sign her name to it. They mounted up, Eli and Rosa sharing old Lucky's saddle, the precious ledger tucked safely in Eli's saddlebag. They urged the horses into a trot, eager to put the lights of the town behind them. They were halfway back to the camp, riding through a dark patch of cottonwoods, when the night exploded again. A shot rang out, this one not a warning, but a deliberate, aimed attack. A bullet tore through the darkness. It was followed by the high, piercing scream of a horse in pain. Lucky stumbled, his legs buckling beneath them. They were thrown to the ground as the old horse crashed down. They were in an ambush. They had won the battle in the saloon, but the war had just followed them home. The world was a maelstrom of noise and pain. Eli and Rosa hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the wind from their lungs. The old horse, Lucky, lay on its side, a dark shape in the moonless night, its breathing a ragged, terrible sound. A second shot splintered the tree beside Eli's head. They were exposed, pinned down. Miguel, who had been riding a short distance ahead, had already dismounted and melted into the shadows, his rifle at the ready. Eli pushed Rosa toward a shallow ditch at the side of the track. "Stay down," he commanded, his voice a low growl. He crawled to Lucky's side, the precious ledger still in his saddlebag. He worked quickly, his knife flashing as he cut the bag free. The old horse tried to lift its head, its eyes wide with pain and confusion. The bullet had taken it high in the flank, a bad wound but maybe not a fatal one. Another shot, and then a return shot from Miguel's position. The ambushers were firing blind, their muzzle flashes giving away their positions. Eli scrambled back to the ditch, dragging the heavy saddlebag. "We have to get back to the camp," he whispered to Rosa. "It is our only chance." They began to move, a slow, agonizing crawl through the dirt and scrub, pulling the wounded horse along. Lucky, with a courage that belied his age, struggled to his feet and limped after them, a loyal, suffering shadow. It took them the better part of an hour to cover the half-mile back to the derelict camp, every shadow a potential enemy, every rustle of leaves a threat. They had just stumbled into the relative safety of the barn when the sky turned on them. The wind, which had been a low moan, rose to a frantic shriek. And then the sound began. A soft patter at first, then a roar. It was not rain. The sky was throwing rocks at them. Hailstones. First the size of peas, then marbles, then walnuts, hammered the dry earth and the tin roof of the cabin. The noise inside the barn was deafening, a relentless, punishing drumbeat. Rosa rushed to Lucky's side, using her own body to shield the horse's head from the ice projectiles that began to punch through the rotted wood of the barn roof. The old structure groaned under the assault. A heavy crossbeam, weakened by years of neglect and now battered by the hail, splintered with a loud crack. It began to sag, directly over Rosa and the horse. Eli saw it happen in a flash of terrible clarity. He lunged, his body moving on pure instinct. He shoved Rosa and the horse out of the way, taking the full, crushing weight of the falling timber across his own shoulder. A white-hot explosion of pain shot through him, and his arm went numb. The beam pinned him to the ground. His shoulder twisted at an unnatural angle. Rosa screamed his name. Through a haze of pain, he saw her struggling to lift the beam. It was too heavy. And then, as if their world was not already a hell of pain and noise, a new light appeared, an orange, flickering light, coming from the direction of the cabin. They had company. McKean's men had followed them, and seeing them trapped, had decided to finish the job. They had set fire to the small hayrick beside the cabin. The flames, fanned by the storm winds, leaped with an unnatural hunger, racing toward the barn. "We have to go!" Rosa screamed over the roar of the hail and the crackle of the fire. She put her back under the beam, her muscles straining, her face a mask of desperate effort. "Now, Eli!" He gritted his teeth, the world turning gray at the edges. With a surge of adrenaline, he heaved his body, and together, they shifted the timber just enough for him to wriggle free. His left arm was useless, a dead weight hanging at his side. The fire was already licking at the barn door. The hay inside was catching, the smoke thick and choking. Rosa grabbed the ledger from the floor where it had fallen. The leather was already hot to the touch. She cried out, snatching her hand back, the skin on her palm turning an angry red. But she did not drop it. She tucked the book under her good arm and then grabbed Eli. She was no longer the frightened girl who had stumbled into his campfire. She was a force of nature in her own right. She half dragged, half carried him toward the back of the barn. to a small opening in the wall he had never bothered to repair. They stumbled out into the raging storm, just as the roof of the barn gave way in a shower of sparks and burning embers. They fell into the mud, the cold rain now mixing with the hail, hissing where it hit the burning wood. They had escaped, but they had lost everything. They huddled in the darkness, watching their sanctuary burn. When the fire had died down and the hail had lessened to a cold, miserable rain, Miguel found them. He saw Eli's shoulder, the unnatural angle of it, and his face grew grim. "This is over," Eli said, his voice strained with pain. "You have to take her. Get her to Lydia's house. It is the only safe place left." "No," Rosa protested, her voice choked with tears. "I am not leaving you." "You have to," he insisted, his good hand gripping her arm. "They are not hunting me. They are hunting you. And that book. I will just slow you down. I will double back, lead them off, give you time." It was the hardest decision of his life, to send her away, to push her out of his protection and into the unknown. But it was the only decision. He was a liability, wounded and weak. He was putting her in more danger just by being near her. After a tearful, desperate argument, she finally relented, her loyalty to the cause warring with her loyalty to him. Miguel helped her onto his horse. She looked down at Eli, her face a pale oval in the pre-dawn light, streaked with soot and tears. He looked up at her, his heart feeling as broken as his body. "Go," he said, his voice raw. He watched them disappear into the gray mist of morning. And then he was alone. He found a deep, eroded gully a few hundred yards from the burned-out camp and slid into it, the cold mud a small comfort to his feverish skin. He lay there, his body screaming in protest, and waited. The pain in his shoulder was a physical anchor to the past. He closed his eyes and saw the blizzard again, a world of white, endless and deadly. He saw his brother's face, blue with cold, lost forever because Eli had misjudged the storm. A wave of self-loathing washed over him, as cold and bitter as the memory. He would not let it happen again. He would not let his choices lead to her death. He would see this through or die trying. History would not repeat itself. Rosa arrived at Lydia Hart's small house in town just as the sun was rising. Lydia took one look at her burned hand and soot-stained face and hustled her inside, asking no questions. She tended to the burn with a gentle, practiced hand. Rosa was safe, but she felt hollowed out, a part of her left behind in the mud and ashes of the camp. Later that day, the preacher came to call. He had heard of the fire, of the events at the saloon. He spoke to Rosa in low, somber tones, his words couched in concern but carrying the sting of judgment. "My dear child," he said, "perhaps it is time to consider your reputation. This town is a small place. To continue this fight will only bring more scandal upon your head. It might be wisest, and most virtuous, for you to simply move on." Rosa looked at the preacher, at his clean hands and his pious certainty. A cold anger, clear and hard, rose within her. "My reputation," she said, her voice steady, "will not save the water supply for the families in this valley. My reputation will not bring a murdered man justice. I will stay." Her faith in Eli, however, was not so steady. As the day wore on, a terrible fear began to creep into her heart. What if he had been captured? What if, in the cold light of day, he decided this fight was not his? What if he chose his own safety and just rode away? She confessed her fear to Lydia that evening. Lydia looked up from the printing press she was cleaning. "Child," she said, her voice soft but firm, "that man chooses you every time he looks at you. I saw it the first time I came to your camp. You need to trust that." The next morning, their cause was given an unexpected boost from an unlikely source. A knock came at Lydia's back door. It was Deputy Harlan. He looked pale and nervous, his eyes darting around as if he expected the sheriff to appear at any moment. He thrust a folded piece of paper into Lydia's hand. "This is not right," he stammered. "What he is doing?" He turned and fled before Lydia could say a word. The paper was a copy of an arrest warrant for Rosa May Callahan. The charge was horse theft and vagrancy, but the warrant was not signed by a judge. It was signed by Sheriff Cade Locke himself, a blatant and illegal abuse of his power. They now had proof that the law was being twisted into a weapon. Eli made his way back to the ruined camp after a full day of hiding. The place was a desolate scar on the landscape. The cabin was a pile of smoking timbers. The barn was a skeleton. He walked through the wreckage, his heart a heavy stone in his chest. In the mud near where the barn door had been, something glinted. He bent down, his shoulder screaming in protest, and picked it up. It was one of Rosa's small, silver earrings, the one she must have lost in the chaos of the fire. He closed his good hand around it, the metal cool against his skin. It was a tiny, fragile thing, but it felt like an anchor. He held it tight, a small piece of her that the fire could not take. A faint, tired smile touched his lips. She is still in the reach of my fate, he thought. He was about to leave when he saw the rider approaching. It was Miguel, his face a mask of grim news. "It is bad, Eli," he said, his voice rough. "Cade and his men, they swept through the hills this morning. They found my camp. They took me." Eli's blood ran cold. "How did you get away?" "I did not," Miguel said, his eyes dark with a terrible message. "They let me go, to bring you a message, an ultimatum. The sheriff has me. He will hang me for aiding a fugitive in 3 days, unless you give him what he wants." Rosa, and the ledger. The news of Miguel's capture was a physical blow. Heavier than any timber, it left them with a choice that was no choice at all. Surrender Rosa and the ledger, or let an innocent man hang. They were trapped, their small rebellion seemingly crushed under the heel of McKean's power. They spent the night in Lydia Hart's cramped back room, the air thick with the smell of ink and despair. Eli sat in a chair, his dislocated shoulder a throbbing, relentless torment, while Lydia applied a cold compress to Rosa's burned hand. It was Lydia who broke the silence, her voice a beacon in the suffocating darkness. "There is a way," she said, her eyes fixed on a notice she had just printed for her newspaper. "Judge Morrison is coming." The circuit judge. He was a figure of distant, almost mythical authority, a man who rode a predictable route through the territory, bringing a semblance of formal law to the wild frontier. He was due in Heaton's Ford in 2 days to hear a backlog of petty disputes over land and livestock. "He will hold court in the saloon," Lydia continued, her mind already working, assembling the pieces of a desperate plan. "It will be a public forum. Cade cannot simply ignore a federal judge. It is our stage." The plan she'd laid out was audacious, a gamble that staked everything on the power of a single public moment. It would be a dual rescue, a legal maneuver designed to free Miguel and expose the sheriff in one fell swoop. To do it, she would need to rally the town, to turn the tide of gossip and fear into a current of righteous anger. And she would need a catalyst. "I will do it," Rosa said, her voice quiet but clear. "I will turn myself in." Eli started to protest, the pain in his shoulder forgotten in a surge of protective instinct. But Rosa met his gaze, and he saw in her eyes a strength that would not be denied. "Not to surrender," she clarified. "To testify. I will walk in there and demand that the judge hear my story." "And while all eyes are on her," Lydia finished, looking at Eli, "you will be our insurance policy." The morning the judge arrived. A nervous energy gripped Heaton's Ford. Lydia had spent the past 36 hours moving through the town like a phantom, speaking to the small ranchers who were being choked by McKean's greed, to the store owners tired of the sheriff's heavy-handed rule, to the wives and mothers who feared the lawlessness that was taking root. She did not ask them to fight. She simply asked them to come and listen. The saloon had been transformed. The gambling tables were pushed to the walls, and rows of benches had been set up, facing the long, polished bar where Judge Morrison, a weary man with a magnificent white mustache, would preside. The place was packed, a tense, sweating mass of humanity. Rosa walked through the swinging doors alone. A hush fell over the room. Every eye was on her. She wore a simple, clean dress Lydia had lent her. Her hair was neatly combed, and her burned hand was wrapped in a clean white bandage. She looked small and vulnerable, but she walked with a straight back and a steady gaze, directly toward the judge, Sheriff Cade, standing near the bar with Silas McKean, a confident smirk on his face, moved to intercept her. "This woman is a fugitive." "Judge," Cade announced, his voice booming, "I am placing her under arrest." "On what charge?" a clear voice called out. Lydia Hart stepped forward, the illegal warrant in her hand, "on the charge of a crime you invented, Sheriff." Before Cade could respond, Rosa spoke, her voice not loud, but carrying a clarity that cut through the tension. "Your Honor, my name is Rosa May Callahan. I am not a thief. I am a witness to a murder, and I demand the right to give my testimony." The judge, intrigued by this unexpected drama, stroked his mustache. He looked from Rosa's earnest face to Cade's furious one. "Very well," he said. "The court will hear it." As the proceedings began, Eli slipped through the back alleys of the town, his left arm bound tightly to his chest in a crude sling Lydia had fashioned. The pain was a constant, grinding fire. But he pushed it down, his focus absolute. He made his way to the livery stable behind the saloon, the scent of hay and horses a familiar comfort. From a dusty window in the hayloft, he had a clear view of the saloon's back entrance. He settled in to wait, a ghost with a gun, an avenging angel in the shadows. Inside the saloon, a battle of wits was underway. Lydia, acting as Rosa's counsel, was a master of legal precision. She quoted the territorial water code, her voice ringing with authority. Explaining the public's right to the valley's water, she laid out the foundation of their case, piece by careful piece. Cade laughed it off, leaning against the bar as if it were all a grand joke. Silas McKean, ever the businessman, quietly tried to pass a thick envelope to the judge's clerk, a bribe that was coolly and publicly refused. Then it was Rosa's turn to speak. She stood before the crowd, not as an accuser, but as a citizen. She told them what she had seen at the spring, her voice trembling at first, then growing stronger as she spoke. She finished by looking not at the judge, but at the faces of the people on the benches, her neighbors. "I do not have a fancy title or a fine piece of land," she said, her voice resonating with a simple, profound honesty. "I have nothing to offer you but the truth. The truth, and these two hands, which are all I have ever had to make my way in this world." A murmur went through the crowd. She was one of them. Her words struck a chord of shared struggle and quiet dignity. Lydia then presented the evidence. She placed the blood-stained map on the bar, its significance now clear to everyone. Then she held up the ledger. The saloon went dead silent as she read from its pages. A payment to Sheriff Cade for security services, a purchase of a large quantity of blasting powder, an entry detailing the acquisition of mining claims around the spring. She placed McKean's heavy metal seal on the bar and showed how it matched the impression in the ledger's wax seals. The web was complete, connecting the money, the power, and the murder. Cade's face was a mask of thunderous rage. He turned on Eli, who had just stepped into the saloon, his presence a sudden, shocking shift in the room's dynamic. "This is all you're doing, Booker," he snarled. "You always were a meddler. Could not even save your own kin from a little snow. What makes you think you can save this girl?" The mention of his brother was a spark to dry tinder. A lifetime of grief and guilt erupted in Eli. "It was not the snow that killed him. Cade," he said, his voice low and shaking with a cold fury that silenced the room. "It was a coward who was supposed to be leading the party, a man who panicked and ran when the storm hit, leaving women and children to freeze. A man named Cade Locke. A gasp went through the crowd. The story of the lost party from that terrible winter was a local tragedy, a painful scar on the town's memory. Now, the missing piece of that story had been supplied. Eli's quest for justice was not just for Rosa, it was for a ghost. It was the final blow. Deputy Harlan, who had been standing near the door, his face pale and slick with sweat, took a hesitant step forward. "He cannot," he stammered, his voice cracking. "He cannot sign warrants. He is not a judge. The arrest order. It was not legal. He lied." The confession shattered the last vestiges of the sheriff's authority. The dam of fear and intimidation that had held the town in its grip for so long finally broke. An angry roar went up from the crowd. They surged forward, their faces a mixture of fury and newfound courage. Silas McKean, a man who had never faced a situation he could not buy or bully his way out of, panicked. The law had turned against him. The people had turned against him. In a single, desperate motion, he lunged for Rosa. He grabbed her, pulling her in front of him as a shield, a pistol appearing in his hand as if from nowhere. "Back off!" he screamed, his voice shrill with fear. "Everybody back off!" He began to drag Rosa toward the door, toward the chaos of the street, toward the train station at the edge of town, his only possible escape. The crowd fell back, horrified. Eli, ignoring the searing pain in his shoulder, pushed his way through, his eyes locked on Silas and Rosa. The chase was on. Rain began to fall, a cold, hard drizzle that turned the dusty street to slick mud. Silas scrambled onto a buckboard wagon, yanking Rosa up beside him. Eli did not hesitate. He climbed onto the narrow porch of the general store. Pulling himself onto the roof, he began to run across the slick, wet shingles, leaping from one building to the next, a grim, one-armed specter against the gray, weeping sky. He shadowed the wagon below, keeping pace, waiting for his moment. He reached the train station just as Silas was pulling Rosa from the wagon. A train was sitting on the tracks, steam hissing from its engine, preparing for departure. The platform was a scene of chaos. Silas, holding the gun to Rosa's head, tried to force a path through the terrified passengers. Eli dropped from the roof of the station, landing in a crouch on the platform behind them. The sharp crack of a gun hammer being cocked cut through the noise. Then another. Eli had his pistol out. Cade, who had followed the chase, stood at the other end of the platform, his own gun drawn. It was a three-way standoff, frozen in a moment of unbearable tension. The train whistle blew, a long, mournful scream that tore through the rain and the grit. Silas saw his chance. He shoved Rosa toward Cade, a diversion, and leaped for a flat car on the slowly moving train. Cade, instead of helping Rosa, turned his gun on Eli. But before he could fire, Silas, now on the train, fired back, not wanting to leave a witness. In that split second, Eli dove, tackling Rosa, pulling them both off the platform and into the muddy space between the tracks. The train chugged past, picking up speed, carrying Silas McKean away, but Cade was still there, and he had Rosa. He dragged her toward a horse tied nearby. "We will finish this at Red Knife Canyon." Cade screamed over the noise of the departing train, his face a mask of insane fury. He threw Rosa onto the horse, leaped up behind her, and spurred the animal into a gallop, disappearing into the gray, rain-swept prairie. The wind in Red Knife Canyon was a living thing. It howled through the narrow rock passages, a mournful, angry sound that scoured the sandstone and peeled away the loose dirt. It lifted the fine red dust from the canyon floor, swirling it into thick clouds that moved like the smoke of a battlefield, choking the air and painting the world in shades of blood and rust. In the center of this desolate theater, a single wagon stood precariously close to the canyon's edge. On the driver's seat, Rosa was bound hand and foot, the rough rope chafing her wrists. Beside her sat Sheriff Cade Locke, his face a mask of crazed desperation, and standing near the horses, a figure she had prayed never to see again, was Silas McKean. He had not gone far on that train. He had jumped off a few miles out, met a subordinate, and then, with the devil's own luck, had come across this freight wagon bound for a distant mining operation. The crates in the back, stenciled with warnings, were filled with dynamite. They had been waiting for him. Cade had known Eli would follow. This canyon was the perfect trap, a place with no cover and no escape. The wind whipped a strand of hair across Rosa's face, and she stared out at the swirling red dust, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. Then a figure emerged from the dust cloud, walking, not riding. It was Eli. He moved with a slow, deliberate pace, his injured arm strapped tight against his body, his face grim and etched with pain and exhaustion. He stopped about 50 feet from the wagon, a lone man against two armed opponents and a desperate situation. He looked at Rosa, a world of anguish and resolve passing between them in a single, silent glance. Silas McKean laughed, the sound thin and sharp against the wind. "It is over. Booker, you have lost. Give it up, and I might let the girl live." Eli's gaze shifted from Rosa to the two men. His movements were slow, almost ceremonial. He reached up with his good hand and took off his hat, holding it at his side. The wind caught his dark hair, whipping it around his face. He looked like a preacher about to deliver a final, damning sermon. When he spoke, his voice was not loud, but it cut through the howl of the wind, raw and clear and filled with an unshakable conviction. "The night she stumbled into my fire, my lonely life ended," he said, his eyes locking onto theirs, pinning them with the force of his words. "You two cannot take that away from me." The statement, so simple and so profound, hung in the red air. It was not a threat, it was a truth, spoken with the finality of a death knell. For a moment, both McKean and Cade were stunned into silence by the sheer, unexpected poetry of the declaration. In that moment, Eli moved. His good arm came up, his pistol appearing in his hand, but he did not aim for Cade. He did not aim for McKean. He aimed for the thick leather strap that lashed the wagon's rear wheel to the frame. A makeshift brake Cade had applied to keep it from rolling. The shot was a single, sharp crack. The bullet severed the strap. The heavy wagon, no longer secured on the slight incline, gave a violent lurch forward. The sudden movement threw Cade off balance. The horses, spooked by the gunshot and the shifting load, whinnied in terror and plunged forward, dragging the wagon directly toward the canyon's edge. Rosa reacted with the speed of a cornered animal. As the wagon careened past a narrow rock ledge, she threw her body sideways, a desperate bound leap into the abyss. For a heart-stopping second, she was airborne, a falling star in a red sky. Eli was already moving, his body fueled by a surge of pure, desperate love. He lunged, ignoring the fire in his shoulder. His good arm outstretched, he caught her. The impact was brutal, sending them both tumbling to the hard ground. He twisted as they fell, taking the brunt of the landing on his good side, his body a shield for hers. The wagon, with a screaming Cade Locke aboard, teetered for a moment on the precipice before plunging over the edge in a terrible crash of splintering wood and terrified horseflesh. Eli lay on the ground, the breath knocked out of him. Rosa a warm, living weight on top of him. He had her. She was safe. A movement from the dust made him look up. Silas McKean, his face contorted in a snarl of fury, was running, not toward Eli, but away, scrambling back toward the mouth of the canyon. At the same time, another figure appeared, a man on horseback, riding hard. It was Deputy Harlan. McKean, in his panicked flight, did not see the single stick of dynamite that had been jolted from a crate and fallen to the ground. His running foot came down squarely on it. The impact was not enough to detonate it, but it was enough to send him sprawling. From behind Eli, a shot rang out. It was not from McKean. It was from the wreckage of the wagon. Cade, somehow still alive, had crawled from the splintered wood, his gun in his hand, aimed squarely at Eli's back. But the shot that found its mark came from the other direction. Deputy Harlan, his face set and grim, sat on his horse, his pistol smoking. Cade Locke collapsed without a sound, his reign of terror over. Harlan dismounted and walked to the whimpering, terrified Silas McKean, kicking the pistol from his reach. The former cattle baron was captured, alive and defeated. Rosa pushed herself up, her first act to frantically work at the ropes on Eli's sling, then her own. The moment she was free, she threw her arms around Eli's neck, burying her face in the curve of his throat. She clung to him, her body shaking with a storm of relief and terror. She breathed in the familiar scent of him, dust and leather and sweat, the scent of safety, the scent of home. He held her with his one good arm, his entire body trembling with exhaustion and the massive, shuddering release of a tension that had been coiled inside him for weeks. He was not strong. He was not a hero. He was just a man who had refused to lose the only thing that mattered. They stayed like that for a long time, the red dust settling around them, the wind beginning to soften its mournful song. Then they heard the sound of approaching riders. It was not a posse. It was a delegation. Lydia Hart rode at the head, her face grim but triumphant. Behind her were the ranchers and the townsfolk, the people who had found their courage in a saloon courtroom. They stopped a respectful distance away. There was no cheering. Instead, a slow, scattered applause began. A sound of hands, calloused and work-worn, clapping in a sparse but steady rhythm. It was a sound of profound respect, a turning of the moral tide. Eli, with Rosa's help, got to his feet. He stood before the people of Heaton's Ford, his clothes torn, his body battered, but his spirit unbroken. He looked at Rosa, then out at the crowd. "I do not need a person to own," he said, his voice raspy but carrying to every ear. "I need a person to choose, every single morning." His words, a public echo of the private promise he had made to her, settled over the small crowd. A simple and powerful truth. Rosa looked up at him, and in the depths of his tired eyes, she saw it, the flicker of a flame, steady and warm, the light of the first campfire. The one she had stumbled toward out of the darkness had not been a temporary shelter. It had become a home. A short time later, Judge Morrison arrived with a contingent of federal marshals. He surveyed the scene, the wrecked wagon, the captured Silas McKean, the body of the former sheriff. He listened to Lydia's crisp, clear account of the events. He looked at the ledger, at the map, at the signed testimony Rosa had written the night before. He signed the papers then and there, his authority absolute, a formal warrant for the arrest of Silas McKean on charges of murder, conspiracy, and bribery, an order for the removal of Cade Locke's body. The case, he declared, would be transferred to the federal court. The law, slow and ponderous but powerful, had finally arrived. As the marshals led a shackled and whimpering Silas McKean away, a strange thing happened. The thick, red dust that had choked the canyon began to thin. The wind died down to a whisper, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, a patch of clean, brilliant blue sky appeared overhead. The storm, both real and metaphorical, was over. Eli reached out and took Rosa's hand, their fingers intertwined, a natural, easy fit, together. They turned away from the canyon of red dust and began to walk toward the waiting townspeople, toward the new, clean sky. They did not return to Heaton's Ford as heroes. They came back as survivors, weary and wounded, to a home that was nothing but a pile of ash and a skeleton of a barn. The rain had stopped, but the air was thick with the smell of wet soot and despair. The sight of the devastation was a physical blow, a reminder of how close they had come to losing everything. They stood there for a long time, the silence broken only by the drip of water from the scorched cottonwood trees. The work of rebuilding began not with a grand plan, but with a single, simple act. Eli, his left arm now properly set and bound in a sling by the town's doctor, found a fence post that had been knocked over in the chaos. With his one good arm, he began the laborious process of digging a new hole and setting the post upright. Rosa, her burned hand carefully bandaged, started gathering the scattered tools that had survived the fire. They worked in silence, their shared purpose a language that needed no words. They were reclaiming their small piece of the world, one fence post at a time. They were not alone for long. The first to arrive was Barnaby Pike, the neighbor who had betrayed them. He came with his hat in his hands and his eyes on the ground, a deep shame etched into the lines of his face. He did not say a word. He just picked up a shovel and began to dig. Soon after, another rancher appeared with a wagon full of fresh lumber. Then another, carrying a box of nails. By midday, a dozen men from the town and the surrounding homesteads were there, working under the pale sun. It was their apology, offered not in words, but in sweat and calloused hands. These were the men who had whispered about the strange woman living with the quiet cowboy, the men who had ridden in the sheriff's posse. Now, they were rebuilding the barn they had indirectly helped destroy. They were mending the fences of the community, righting a wrong with the slow, honest labor of their bodies. Their wives came too, bringing baskets of bread and cold meat and jugs of fresh water, their silent offerings a balm on the wounds of gossip and suspicion. In the quiet evenings, after the work was done and the neighbors had gone home, a new intimacy grew between Eli and Rosa. The violent, desperate moments that had thrown them together were gone, replaced by a deep, steady peace. She would tend to his shoulder, carefully changing the bandages, her touch gentle and sure. He would sit, still and patient, watching her, a look of quiet wonder in his eyes. The pain of the injury was real, but in her care, it became something else, a shared burden that bound them closer. One evening, he presented her with a gift. He had spent the afternoon with a piece of scrap leather and his sharpest knife. With his one good hand, he had painstakingly carved and braided a small, elegant strap, perfect for securing a bedroll to a saddle. And into the soft leather, he had tooled two simple initials, R.M. "It is for your journey," he said, his voice a little rough. "So you are always a partner, not a passenger." She took the small strap, her fingers tracing the letters. It was a humble thing, but it felt more precious than gold. It was a promise of companionship, an acknowledgement that her path was her own, but that he would be there to ride it with her. The ripples of their stand in the saloon spread far beyond Heaton's Ford, Lydia Hart's newspaper, carrying a full, unflinching account of the murder, the land grab, and the final confrontation, was picked up by papers in Cheyenne and even Denver. The story of the corrupt sheriff and the cattle baron became a cautionary tale for the entire territory. The railroad, facing a public relations disaster and the threat of federal investigation, quickly issued a statement promising a full review of all water rights along its new line. The small ranchers, emboldened by McKean's fall, met in Lydia's print shop and formed a grange, a formal alliance to protect their collective interests. The balance of power in the valley had shifted, not with a bang, but with the steady, relentless pressure of the truth. Life at the camp settled into a new rhythm, the rhythm of healing and construction. The barn rose again, its new wood smelling of fresh pine. A new roof, sound and watertight, was laid on the cabin. The immediate life-or-death struggle was over, but the internal storms had yet to fully subside. One night, a chill wind blew down from the mountains, a reminder that winter was not so far away. They sat inside the small cabin, a fire crackling in the hearth, the first fire they had built there since the blaze. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls, and the warmth soaked into their tired bodies. Rosa sat on the floor, leaning against Eli's chair. She was quiet for a long time, watching the flames. Then, she reached up, her hand finding his. She turned her head and rested her forehead against his knee. A simple, trusting gesture. "I am not afraid anymore," she whispered. The words spoken so softly he almost did not hear them. He looked down at the top of her head, at the way the firelight caught in her dark hair. The fear had been his constant companion for so long. The fear of loss, the fear of repeating the past, the fear of failing the people he cared for. But looking at her now, safe and whole in the warm circle of their small home, he realized the fear had finally loosened its grip. "Neither am I," he answered, his voice thick with an emotion he could not name. The world outside the cabin, with its lingering dangers and uncertain future, faded away. There was only the warmth of the fire, the quiet strength of their clasped hands, and the profound, unspoken peace of two people who had found shelter not in a place, but in each other. As the weeks passed, a new purpose took root. The ranchers who had come to help rebuild all had children who spent their days working, with no time or opportunity for schooling. Rosa, seeing the need, cleaned off the new porch of the cabin, found a few spare planks to use as benches, and, using charcoal and smoothed pieces of bark, started a school. 3 days a week, a small, eager flock of children would make their way to the camp to learn their letters and numbers from her. She was a natural teacher, patient and kind, and the sound of children's laughter became a regular music at the old winter camp. Her new role spurred a change in Eli as well. A local rancher, the first man who had shown up to help them rebuild, offered him the position of foreman, a steady job managing his herds. It was a permanent position, a job that required a man to stay in one place. Eli, who had spent his entire adult life moving, a hired gun with no ties, accepted without hesitation. He was done with the life of a drifter. He was putting down roots. His new settled life presented an unexpected challenge. He found himself sitting at the back of Rosa's porch school one afternoon, listening to the children read aloud. He, who could read a trail or the mood of a nervous herd better than any man, found the squiggles on the page to be an indecipherable code. That evening, with a sheepish look on his face, he asked Rosa to teach him. His efforts were clumsy and slow. His big, calloused fingers struggled to hold the delicate charcoal. The letters that came so easily to the children seemed to mock him, twisting and turning before his eyes. One afternoon, a little girl with bright pigtails, seeing his frustration, piped up, "Which letter kicked your horse?" "Mr. Booker." The other children giggled, and a deep red flush crept up Eli's neck. Rosa just smiled, a warm, affectionate look in her eyes that made the embarrassment worth it. Their old horse, Lucky, became the living symbol of their new life. His wound had healed into a clean scar, and his limp had all but disappeared. He spent his days grazing peacefully in the new corral, a patriarch watching over the changing landscape. One day, Rosa tied a bright yellow ribbon she had salvaged from a dress to his mane. The splash of color on the old, scarred horse was a small, joyful declaration of hope, a testament to the stubborn resilience of life. Even the town's moral compass, the preacher, found his way back to the camp. He arrived one Sunday not with condemnation, but with a humble offering of a freshly baked pie. He apologized to Rosa, his words stiff but sincere. "I was mistaken." He admitted, "I have learned that a person's virtue is not found in the absence of gossip, but in the presence of courage. It is," he concluded, "a truth that is lived, not rumored." When the first hay was cut and the harvest was brought in, the town held a celebration. It was a night of fiddles and banjos, of dancing and laughter under a sky full of stars. The community, now forged stronger by the trials they had faced, insisted that Eli and Rosa join the dance. They were awkward at first. a cowboy with a stiff shoulder and a woman more used to books than dancing. They stepped on each other's feet and laughed, their clumsy movements a joyful release, surrounded by the scent of dry straw, the warmth of their neighbors, and the lively, hopeful music. They were no longer outsiders. They were part of the rhythm of the life they had fought so hard to protect. Late in the evening, Eli stepped away from the noise and the light. He stood under the familiar shadow of a large cottonwood tree, watching. He saw Rosa, her face flushed and smiling, talking with Lydia. The moonlight caught her as she reached up to retie a loose strand of hair, her movements full of an easy grace and a quiet confidence that had not been there before. She was home. They were home. And as he stood there, watching the woman who had stumbled into his life and changed it forever, a quiet, certain decision took root in his heart and began to grow. The decision that had taken root under the cottonwood tree at the harvest dance did not blossom into words for many weeks. It grew quietly inside Eli, a patient, steady thing, like a seed waiting for the perfect conditions to sprout. He worked his new job as foreman, his shoulder healing into a stiff but functional joint. He watched Rosa's school flourish, the porch filled with the bright, eager faces of the valley's children. He saw the way she moved through their small, rebuilt world, with a grace and a purpose that seemed to make the very air around her calmer. He began his project in secret. He found one of Lucky's old horseshoes, a worn, discarded crescent of iron that the old horse had shed months ago. In the small forge the town blacksmith let him use after hours. He heated and hammered the old metal. It was a slow, difficult process with one good arm. He was not a smith, but he was patient, and he was determined. Night after night, he worked the iron, the clang of his hammer a quiet, rhythmic prayer in the dark. He beat the luck and the history and the endurance of the old horse into a new shape, slowly, painstakingly, forging a simple, unadorned circle. He chose a day when the autumn sun was warm and the sky was a deep, cloudless blue. He found Rosa by the creek, watching the water, now running clear and full, gurgle over the smooth stones. He stood beside her for a moment, just breathing in the clean air, the scent of pine and damp earth. He did not have a speech prepared. The words he needed were simple, and they came not from his head, but from a place deeper than thought. He got down on one knee, not with the flourish of a gentleman in a drawing room, but with the solid, earthy motion of a man who was more comfortable with the ground than with polished floors. The dust of the land they had fought for puffed up around his knee. He held out the small, dark ring. It was not shiny or perfect. It was rough and honest, like the man who had made it. His voice was a low rasp, thick with the weight of the moment. "Not to keep you, Rosa," he said, his eyes holding hers, "but to choose you today and all the tomorrows." Rosa looked from the ring, a perfect circle forged from a broken one, to the face of the man kneeling before her. She saw the lines of hardship and loss, but she also saw the unwavering strength, the profound tenderness, the quiet, steadfast love that had been her anchor in the storm. Warm tears welled in her eyes, not of sorrow, but of a joy so deep it was almost painful. She gave him the only answer that mattered, a word that held all the promises of a shared lifetime. Yes. She did not wait for him to stand. She knelt in the dust with him, her simple answer followed by an embrace that was both a beginning and an end. It was the end of their separate paths, and the beginning of a single road, stretching out before them into the vast, unknown landscape of the future. Their wedding was not an event. It was a gathering. It took place a week later, under the vast, sheltering branches of the old cottonwood tree that stood sentinel over their small home. The whole valley came. The benches were filled with the families who had helped them rebuild, their faces scrubbed clean, their work clothes exchanged for their Sunday best. Miguel Ortega was there, his quiet presence a testament to their shared fight. Lydia Hart stood beside Rosa, her face beaming with a proud, maternal light. The preacher, now a humble and changed man, offered a simple prayer, but it was Lydia who gave the blessing. She did not read from a book. She spoke from the heart, of the courage it takes to build a home, not just with wood and nails, but with trust and truth. In the back of the crowd, a lone figure stood. Apart from the rest, it was Harlan, the former deputy. As Lydia finished speaking, he slowly, deliberately, unpinned the silver star from his shirt, the last vestige of his old life. He held it in his palm for a moment, then closed his fingers around it and bowed his head, a silent act of penance and respect. There was no lavish feast, just long tables laden with cornbread and apple cider, the simple, honest food of the land. The music of a single fiddle filled the air, a sweet, hopeful melody that seemed to speak of new beginnings. The themes of the day were unspoken, but felt by all. They saw in the quiet love between Eli and Rosa that justice was not just something won in a courtroom, but something lived, every day, in the small choices of how you treat one another. They saw that a person's honor was not in their name or their wealth, but in the strength of their actions. And they saw that the weakest among them did not need pity, but simply a chance, a patch of ground on which to stand and fight for what was right. News had come from Cheyenne the week before. The federal court had been swift, with the ledger, the map, and a dozen witnesses from Heaton's Ford. The case was airtight. Silas McKean was convicted on all charges, his empire of greed and intimidation crumbling to dust. The official records were amended. Cade Locke was posthumously stripped of his office, his name now a synonym for corruption. The water rights, as laid out in the miner's original deed, were affirmed for all time, secured not just by law, but by the will of a community that had found its voice. It was as if the land itself sighed in relief. The autumn rains came, not in a punishing deluge, but as a gentle, soaking balm. The prairie, which had been so harsh and unforgiving, responded with a burst of life. New green shoots of grass poked through the damp earth. The ranchers reported a season of healthy, strong calves, their herds thriving in the renewed peace. The world felt softer, as if it were rewarding the small acts of human decency that had taken place upon it. The rhythm of their life together slowed to a gentle, comfortable pace. Their days were measured not by crisis and fear, but by the small, quiet moments that make up a life. The scent of coffee brewing in the pre-dawn chill, the comfortable creak of saddle leather as Eli rode out to work, the soft scratch of charcoal on bark as Rosa taught her students on the porch, the feeling of his large, calloused hand closing over her smaller, softer one as they sat on the porch in the evenings, watching the stars prick the vast, dark sky. One day, while cleaning the cabin, Rosa found the small silver earring Eli had recovered from the mud and ash. She had thought it lost forever. She did not put it on. Instead, she hammered a small nail into the wall beside the hearth, the very heart of their home. She hung the single earring there, where the firelight would catch it. It was not jewelry anymore. It was a monument, a small, shining reminder of the long, hard road she had traveled, and of the profound, terrifying, and ultimately beautiful power of a single choice. On their wedding night, after the last guest had departed and a deep, peaceful quiet had settled over the valley, they built a fire outside, near the base of the cottonwood tree. They sat together on a blanket, watching the flames dance, their shoulders touching, their hands intertwined. The night was cool, and the sky was a black velvet blanket studded with 1,000,000 diamond chips of starlight. Eli looked into the fire, a slow, gentle smile touching his lips. He looked at Rosa, at the way the firelight played on her face, and the last of the shadows from his past finally seemed to recede. "That night," he said, his voice a low, soft murmur, "a virgin stumbled into my campfire." He paused, his thumb gently stroking the back of her hand, "and since then, the cowboy's lonely nights ended forever." The words were an echo of that first, tense encounter, but their meaning had been transformed. They were no longer a joke to ward off the darkness, but a simple, beautiful truth. He did not promise her a life free from hardship. The West was still a wild and unforgiving place, and the winters would still be long and cold. She did not promise him a life free from sorrow. The world was full of uncertainty and loss, but they had made a different kind of promise, a stronger one. They had promised to choose each other, every morning, to face the sunrise together. The world outside their small patch of land might be harsh, but here, in the small, warm circle of light cast by their fire, a flame would always be waiting. Thank you for listening to our story. Please let us know where you are tuning in from in the comments so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And do not forget to subscribe to our channel Wild West Night, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.